Hello and welcome to Revere Software's Thought Leadership Sessions. And today I'm really pleased to have Amanda Shantz with me, Dr. Amanda Shantz, I should say, with the University of St. Gallen in Switzerland. And it's been a while since we first met, Amanda, but I want to kind of describe a little bit of how I became introduced to you. I was reading your piece called How Volunteerism Enhances Workplace Skills in the very revered MIT Sloan School of Management review. And there are a couple of things, as you know, that kind of struck me as being super interesting. And disclosure, we both are North Americans, and we're going to be talking about a research study here that pertained to European companies and employee engagement and volunteerism. But here's what I read that kind of struck me. So we're jumping right into things here. So what you found is that many employees admitted that they had never thought about learning from volunteering before. Mm-hmm. For about 2/3 of our interviewees, the interview process itself helped them identify and articulate how and what they had learned, which I found that super interesting. That alone, there's 2/3. And now the other third, even more surprisingly, the remaining third of our interviewees responded defensively or expressed outright anger at the suggestion that volunteering could be used for personal or employer gain. These volunteers were enraged by the idea that volunteering could be anything more than giving back to the community and refused to view it as an opportunity to develop skills. So that was my big wow moment, and I needed to reach out to you. So we're going to come back to all of that. But first and foremost, welcome again on board. Let's talk about this research study that you've done in Europe, and then we'll get to how we think there could be a play here in the United States and North America and Canada as well, and how there may be some differences. So we'll get to all of that because there are some differences here. So welcome and share a little bit more about the study overall, Amanda.
Great, thanks very much, and happy to be here. The paper was conducted, the data was collected a couple of years ago with one of my doctoral students who's now an assistant professor at the University of Maynooth, Ciara Dempsey-Brench. And so Ciara and I were, when we were collecting data in the UK and in Ireland through interviews and focus groups with employee volunteers, we were really surprised at those two key findings. One of them was around learning from volunteering. Why did we find this a surprise? Well, because the literature suggests, most of the academic literature shows that when employees fill out a survey and you ask them, did you learn from volunteering? They say yes. And so it looks like a common outcome of volunteering is actually learning something or skill development. But so that's when you prompt them and you ask them on a survey. But when you sit down with someone across with a cup of coffee and you ask them right out, did you learn something? They say, I've actually never thought of that before. Maybe I have, and then you can probe, and then you can ask them, and then you can say, tell me about this experience, and then what about, did you use this at all in a different environment after? And then they start to understand, well, yeah, actually I have learned a lot. And so whereas we theorize then, or we talk about this interview as a sense-making process, and in this co-creation of data, in fact, between the interviewer and the interviewee, in that we as interviewers caused essentially this new understanding in our interviewees. So this was an interesting insight for us that we think has real practical implications. Because if we put people into volunteering experiences, whether or not they actually acknowledge the learning is probably dependent on whether they have a space to talk about it. So the idea there is the direct practical implication there is that give employees time to talk and to share. Managers should be asking their employees around their experiences, what they've learned, and how they can use it in new environments.
Well, and what's interesting about all this is, people listening and watching right now are probably thinking, okay, but hasn't this been well established before? What was key to this is that there's very limited research in this area. Absolutely. Until you and Ciara started doing the research.
Yeah. No, we know very little about employee volunteering, and so we had no real sense of whether or how people were responding to it. We we do have quite a bit of evidence that corporate volunteering leads to positive affective outcomes. So it feels good, and makes people feel engaged or happy or satisfied at work. It can have sort of a
It's a dopamine. I'd like to say it's a dopamine hit, because it is.
And so that's probably not surprising. It
Yeah.
does feel good. But the question that we were looking at is does it lead people to be or to gain new skills and to be
Yeah.
more effective, and to be more confident in what they do, etc. And so what we found is that absolutely the employees were gaining skills, but it was oftentimes different than the skills that they were donating. So we found that employees tended to donate technical skills,
Mhm.
so very specific skills tied to their education qualifications. But the skills that they gained were the ones that are more around empathy, leadership, mentorship. And what's really important is that those are exactly the skills that are really hard to teach. So
I love this because I'd like to share with my Gen Z colleagues and friends that I come from a day where I sound like an old man saying this, but, and I've talked about this before, where, in corporate America, where I once worked, you were told, here's what percent of your salary you're going to be giving from an employee giving perspective. There was no skills-based volunteering at the time, very limited. It's some traditional volunteering, but it was giving. And you were told how much you were going to give, what percentage of your salary was going to go into this general fund for which you had no control. Well, those days are thankfully long gone. Nonprofits aren't okay with that. Employees sure are not okay with that. And what we're seeing in some of our employer clients is exactly what you're just talking about, is that the employees may be offering, a technical skill or a financial skill, financial modeling, if it's a capital campaign for a nonprofit or what have you, but they're also learning something else. And it can come into play beyond just leadership skills, project management skills. Those are great too. But it can be things like what you just mentioned, building empathy, better understanding of collaboration skills, and just even a sense of mindfulness and balance has come up. I mean, it's just really, I love that holistic side to things. So you did note, I want to quote you one more time here, employers, because I love this quote, employers have begun to view skills-based volunteering as a win-win-win opportunity for all parties involved, the nonprofit, the employer, and the volunteer. And I'd probably add also the nonprofit employee too, in that. Personally, I would add that. But describe that a little bit before we kind of dive deep into what really brought us together in terms of the more provocative side of the research.
Sure. I actually see synergies between this notion of win-win-win and the what some might call you're right, the more provocative side of the findings. Is that is it possible to have this win-win-win? And some folks would say absolutely not. There's always going to be give and take, always going to be a winner and loser. But I think there are experiences and there is evidence that both parties can gain. And I think that the magic lies in how to optimize those gains between the two. And that can be a challenge, particularly for nonprofits who are less powerful for the most part compared to the for-profit companies. So and I do think that skills-based volunteering is a way to meet multiple stakeholders' needs, and I find that theoretically and just ethically really interesting. It's in fact one of the SDGs, the UN Sustainable Development Goals. It's around the let's solve problems through intersectoral partnerships, and this is exactly what skills-based volunteering can do. But there are some people who are more cynical, and some of those people arose in our study. We found that about a third of people became angry. So I'll tell you a story. The first person who became angry, I remember I was in Paris and my doctoral student was in Dublin. No, she was in London, and she called me, and I remember having a cafe somewhere, and she's crying, couldn't believe it. They were getting angry with her. And I thought, isn't that interesting? and so we then she had more of these experiences. Now, not everyone was angry. It was only about a third, but she had more and more
What
experiences.
sector, let me interrupt, quick question. The sector of the companies that you were interviewing, what industry sector?
The sector is banking, and let's come back to that point because it's a really important one. In my view, potentially more important than geography or national culture. But anyways, we found these people who were angry, and when we were looking and kind of scratching under the surface, reading the interview transcripts, it reminded us of this literature called moral outrage, where people can become incredibly angry when you threaten their morality. And so by saying to someone, you're doing this for you, you're doing this to gain something, that's striking at their moral purpose. And they say, absolutely, this isn't for me. I'm doing this because I care about the beneficiary. And how dare you question my motives for my volunteering activities? So they were quite angry, or they were defensive. So they didn't like that type of questioning. They wanted to move away from that type of questioning. They kind of sat back, arms closed, and they were cutting off the conversation. So we had these two different groups. So we had 2/3 who were kind of interesting, curious. Yes, I think I probably did learn something. Good point. And then we had 1/3 who were frustrated, angry, and refused to learn. So then we said, okay, let's go back to the data and let's look at these two groups again. And so we were looking at the data, and what we found is that the two groups generally, for the most part, tended to have different attributions around why their firm had a corporate volunteering program in the first place. So people who were quite positive about their learning experiences believed that their firm believed in the organization's integrity. They believed that the company had the program because they actually cared about the beneficiary. Whereas those who were more negative, those who were turned off by this idea of learning from volunteering, they had more cynical attributions. So they felt that the organization was doing this for lip service. The organization was doing
PR effect.
PR, exactly. So their overall impression of the organization was more negative.
Wow. So what a totally separate conversation on another session someday, but the need for effective internal communications between the CSR team and all their stakeholders across the board, because that's a huge bit of miscommunication, one would hope.
But CSR is one slice of the organization.
Right.
If the rest of the organization has a culture of distrust, if the rest of the organization doesn't treat its employees well, is unfair, is idiosyncratic in the way it deals with people, then even the best CSR team and the best communication from CSR has no match for a stinky organizational culture, right? So you've got an uphill battle as a CSR team if you don't have a culture that is supportive, that's conducive, that people will actually trust and believe that the purpose of this volunteering is actually to support those in need.
If I could draw an exclamation point on our screen right now after what you just said, because that is critical. And, we've been confronted with some prospective clients and to be honest, a couple of clients who came on board our Revere platform for skills-based volunteering too early. They hadn't built out that culture that you're describing, and the education around it, and to assure and give the employees not just the impression, the reality, the fact that no, this is real. We really do care about these beneficiaries, the nonprofits, and the purpose and the cause. And it's not just hot air and PR. And if they don't have that in place, we no longer, you'll be thrilled to hear this, a couple of years ago, as a startup company, we're like, sign on the dotted line. We don't do that anymore. We say time out. Yeah. Let's get your strategy in place first. Let's make certain that the culture is in place, because here's the key. And this is coming from a tech entrepreneur, tech software guy. Build it and they will come does not work. Don't come for a technology solution in advance of what you're talking about. You've got to have the culture in place.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, what do you think? Let's dive deeper into then what are the next steps for the 2/3, the bright side of things here, for the 2/3 of, what can CSR folks and all the stakeholders, HR, marketing, even IT within an organization, what can those stakeholders do from the top level down to educate the 2/3 of like, hey, no, it's really okay for you to be, we want you to be learning something along the way. Don't feel badly that you are learning. Oh yeah, I'm learning something here. And also the 1/3. I mean, that's probably a bigger, you kind of put those aside and say, okay, to what I just said, where you kind of have to deal with the culture first before you even try to educate. What are your thoughts on next steps for those folks?
Yeah. No, I think you're right. If there is generally a positive culture and people trust their employer, it is around education, and it is around having sort of sense making sessions or debriefing sessions, or giving new volunteers a call and just asking them, how did it go? What did you
describe? A sense making session. That might be a new term for some folks listening and watching. Describe what a sense making session.
I have an awful habit of making up words. So that would be probably a word that I've made up that does not exist. But essentially what I would consider
it's not on Word. It's too long for Wordle, but it's not on Wordle.
Too long for Wordle, yeah. Well, what I would mean by a sense making session is just, it could be a phone call, it could be over a coffee, it could be in the office, and just a place for people to talk about what they did and make sense of what they've learned or make sense of their experience. So yeah, I went and this happened and I'm not quite sure what that means. It made me feel uncomfortable, but this is how I reacted. And so making sure that people have a place to make sense of their experiences and say, absolutely, I've learned a tremendous amount around how to have difficult conversations. And so, okay, great. So how can we then solidify that, or make sure that you draw on those new skills in the future when you're in the subsequent difficult conversation? So I think having those types of sessions, making the space to talk about it, it could be devolved to the line manager. So line managers in their training could be encouraged to ask employees about their experiences, etc. And then, just generally good communication around, this is why we're doing it, but there's also opportunities for you to learn. And there's ample examples in corporates doing this very thing, fusing the two messages together. For those, on the other hand, who are cynical, who don't want to learn from volunteering, there's an uphill battle for the CSR team. And I think that there's huge.
Would you even argue that they might not be the right fit to be part of providing skills-based volunteering? There might be other folks who might not be as cynical.
Yes, absolutely. But I think the potentially the answer there is, and what I think is really underdeveloped, is relationships between CSR and HR.
Yeah.
So HR in a lot of places that I've seen just doesn't pay attention to the huge opportunities that volunteering can afford in terms of raising employee engagement, raising trust, learning and development, all kinds of things that HR cares about. CSR is actually doing really, really well. So I think there's a significant potential there for partnership and synergies between the two groups.
Let's wrap up and talk a little, going back to the win-win-win. Let's kind of, if you were to go fast forward a year, that might not be enough, let's say 5 years from now, and going back to these organizations that you have spoken with, the organizations that we hope we will be speaking with together in the next year or so, some of Revere's clients, because we really want to tap into, is it geographical difference? Is it cultural difference within the organization? So there's so much here. What do you think? I'm going to ask you for your hypothesis, which I'm going to put you on the spot here of looking ahead 5 years. What do you envision the win-win-win for each of those sectors 5 years from now? Because this is a morphing, fast-paced area that is growing in terms of skills-based volunteering. What do you see in the future?
What I see might be different from what I hope. So let me describe what I hope for. And
Okay. Fair enough.
what I hope for is, well, you see this sort of pathway where it used to be an accountant would paint a fence or clean a garden or
Yep.
serve at a soup kitchen.
Food.
And then it was an accountant who is donating accountancy skills. And this is kind of what's going on now. And wouldn't it be absolutely amazing if nonprofits and for-profits could be a little bit more strategic around creating experiences, co-creating experiences that were helpful for both parties at hand, and really
Collaboration, going back to what we talked about earlier, that the collaboration pieces, and even not just the nonprofit side, that the employees want more collaboration.
Could we create, or could these different stakeholders really create transformational experiences for employees, while at the same time do more than fill in the gaps?
Yeah.
So do more than, this small piece of work that we just haven't gotten around to, or be able to do our mundane day-to-days. Can we really create these experiences so that we can move this to the next level? It's not just an application of skills. It is far more than that. It's really moving the strategic agenda of the nonprofits to a new level, because I don't know whether that's happening as much as it could be. And that's what I'd love to see is more partnership.
I could not agree more. Well, Dr. Amanda Shantz of the University of St. Gallen in Switzerland, thank you so much. Before we take off here, I want to make certain that if there's anyone, whether it's an employee at a company or an HR department that's interested in reaching out to you, what's the best way to reach you? Via LinkedIn or email?
LinkedIn or email. If you just Google my name, I tend to come up. Amanda Shantz, Shantz, or for Americans, Z. You'll find me at the University of St. Gallen website. My email address is there, as is LinkedIn.
Thank you so much for your thorough research, ongoing research. I can't wait to learn more as you continue the research. And we look forward to working with you on doing some research in the future here in North America. And just, again, thank you so much for your work, your studies, and for participating today. Have a great one.
Thanks, Brian.
Take care. Bye-bye.